Hello and welcome to the Global Forecast from the Economist Intelligence Unit. My name's Tony McMahon, and as ever I'm joined by Robin Bew. Robin, new figures out point to the Eurozone having come out of recession, but three questions remain hanging in the air. Is there still an over-reliance on exports? Has domestic demand recovered sufficiently? And has unemployment yet to reach its peak?
Well, I think it's pretty clear when you look at Europe that there's a lot more rebalancing to be done. So when you talk about the three questions, the export question and the domestic demand question, I guess are flip sides of the same coin, that Europe is still an export-orientated economy, but the rest of the world is not that strong, or certainly some of the bigger parts of it. So America clearly still not strong, the UK not so strong, Asia looking a bit better. But clearly in it, Europe, which is orientated around exports, is going to struggle in a world where some of the world's biggest economies are going to grow slowly for a long time. So you'd want to see more domestic demand, and as you imply, we're not really seeing that, certainly in some of the bigger economies. In places like Germany, the economy is structured towards exports, and actually there's quite a strong domestic political imperative to maintain that. They feel that an export-orientated economy has been very successful to them in the past. They want to stick with that. But actually, we do see the need for more domestic demand within many Eurozone economies, and Germany perhaps more importantly than most, and we're not really getting much of that. And it's hardly a surprise, because Germany, of course, has had a relatively weak domestic demand trend for a long time, and changing that is going to be very difficult, and we don't really see much sign of that happening. So that's still quite a problem. In terms of unemployment, as you say, unemployment's not risen perhaps quite as much as people have thought. I mean, we've been quite impressed by some of the policies that European governments have put in place to try and keep unemployment down. So they've subsidised jobs, tried to go to part-time working. Those things have been successful in putting a cap on unemployment, but unfortunately they're very expensive. They also ossify the labour market, because what it means is that you keep everyone trapped in jobs, potentially in industries that actually need to restructure or change. In Germany's case, actually often export-orientated industries. So our worry is, in the long term, this is actually not good for these economies. It's good for the short term, doesn't help in the long term, and we probably will need to see higher unemployment going forwards, because we do need to see that churning in the labour market. So I suspect there's going to be more pain to come.
If companies are going to invest their way out of the recession, aren't they going to have to cut costs even further? I mean, basically, aren't bosses going to have to carry out the firings they've so far studiously avoided?
Well, they have avoided firings, and actually this is really acting as a real drain on the bottom line, because what you're seeing is that wages are still rising in an environment where output prices, the prices that companies can charge for their products, are not. So that's definitely squeezing margins. Now at the moment, of course, government policy is getting in the way to ease the burden of that on businesses, but in the long run you're going to have to see one or two things. You're either going to have to see individuals accepting much lower pay increases than we've seen to date, which is the way that Japan dealt with this problem in the 1990s, or you're going to see higher unemployment, which is clearly a route that we've seen happening in Europe in past cycles. But the other thing that you're likely to see is a lot of the burden dropping on the informal labour market. So one of the things that's very common in Europe is that there is a kind of protected inner core of labour that doesn't get shed in a downturn, who have a lot of workers' rights, and then there's temporary and part-time labour that gets squeezed very hard. And I think that squeezing process in that cohort of the labour market is going to go on very aggressively, but there will be strains in the main part of the labour market as well, and you will see a lot of pressure for either lower pay increases or unemployment will have to creep up.
A new concern in global markets is that loose monetary conditions are causing asset price bubbles that could pop all too easily. Now, we've seen several indices rising impressively, but do you think there's a risk of all of that going into reverse gear?
Well, when you look around the world at the moment, it's no longer a unified picture. I think it's very interesting that last year we talked about a global crisis, and it was truly global, with Europe and America and Asia all going down together. As we look at what's going to happen over the course of 2010, you do see a much more nuanced picture. Some bits of the world are already recovering, and you're seeing policy tightening as a result. So if you look to Asia, you're seeing economies there start to move upwards. You're also seeing some of the big commodity producers in other bits of the world start to tighten policy and look rather stronger. But you do see other bits of the world, America, continental Europe, the UK, still very weak, still very loose monetary policies particularly, and that fueling a lot of liquidity sloshing around the world that's going into many speculative assets. I think China is perhaps the most obvious place where we worry about the pace of capital inflows and what that's doing to asset prices and potentially bubbles inflating. What's going to happen going forwards? Well, I guess there's one of two things could happen. Ultimately, you're going to see the US, particularly because that's the currency, the dollar is a currency which is funding a lot of this. You're going to see the US start to raise interest rates, and some of this could reverse, hopefully gently, but potentially spectacularly. So you could see a bursting of bubbles in some markets. Of course, the other thing that you could see happening is actually policy stays loose for much longer than people are expecting. Remember, in Japan, constantly through the 1990s, we saw the central bank try to tighten policy, and many commentators thinking that policy would quite quickly move back to a more normal setting. It never did. It funded a lot of bubbles in other bits of the world because of the carry trade. You could see that happening in America too, and allowing bubbles to continue to inflate actually for quite a long time. And of course, that's a worry, because we know from this crisis that big bubbles can be very painful when they burst. And I think Asia is a place you have to look for those bubbles inflating, because that's where everyone feels optimistic.
You've hinted there at a change in the global economic balance, and we're seeing an impressive recovery in China, Brazil lifting off. So are we going to see the BRIC economies playing a much bigger role coming out of this recession?
Yeah, I mean, they're still relatively small in comparison to the developed markets, and it is important to remember that, because I think some of the hype you see in the press would lead you to believe that they're absolutely enormous, dominate the global economy. That's just not true. America and continental Europe still the most important places by far. But it's absolutely true that the BRIC economies and other emerging economies will grow, as they have done in the past, much more quickly than the rich world. And indeed, I think the growth gap is going to be bigger going forwards, because of course in the last decade, America, Europe have been experiencing much higher rates of growth than we've generally assumed will be sustainable because of this credit-funded boom that we've had. Going forwards, of course, that won't be the case. You're going to see Europe and US growing perhaps by a couple of percentage points a year, whereas places like China are still going to be doing 8 or 9% growth. Brazil probably 4, maybe even 5% if they're a bit lucky. Russia has some unique problems of its own, but given it's an energy economy and we think oil demand will gradually rise as China continues to develop, they grow more quickly, and India is doing very, very well. So the growth gap is going to increase, and that inevitably means, of course, that those economies will gradually become a bigger and bigger chunk of the world economy. And most of the businesses that we work with, who are very international in outlook, are positioning themselves for that. They already have a lot of investments in those emerging market economies, but the story that they're propagating right now is that they want to put even more assets into those economies, perhaps even at the price of their exposure to the rich world. So we are seeing some businesses talk about running down their exposure in America and Europe to support bigger engagement in places like India and China, because they see that's where all the opportunities are, and I think they're probably right in that.
We're turning to the United States. It's a year since President Barack Obama was elected. How would you mark his report card on the US economy?
Well, he clearly was dealt pretty difficult hand to play when he took over, so I think it's I'm sure that when you read a lot of commentary about this, there's a discussion about the terrible recession and maybe Obama didn't do enough, but actually they have been very aggressive in terms of policy. Some of it's not been directly under his control. The Fed has been extremely active, but you have seen fiscal policy enacted in a way that I think has been quite impressive. They haven't managed to spend all the money they've announced, and that's been true, of course, in Europe as well. It's only places like China where the government's really able to pull the levers quite so impressively, but they did announce a lot of packages. They have done quite a bit. But I think the difficulty for Obama is less about the immediate response to the recession, because pumping a lot of stimulus, a bit politically contentious, particularly around the deficit, but actually not that hard. I think for Obama, the difficult thing is these longer term structural policies, such as healthcare, such as climate change, where he's clearly struggling to get a settlement that's going to deliver the things that he wants. If you look at healthcare, for example, which is an important long-run economic issue as well as a fiscal issue. And I think the problem there is that the issues are very divisive. He, by nature, is a consensus politician. These aren't necessarily consensus issues, and I can see that if he thinks the last year has been difficult, I suspect the next few years are going to be equally hard and possibly even harder.
Thank you, Robin. Well, join us again next month for more incisive comment from the Global Forecast, brought to you by the Economist Intelligence Unit.